Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This is a series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. Thanks for everyone joining us today. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico in our Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. That's the Q&A box, not the chat box. And just know that we hold those off until the end. We do try to get to as many questions as we can. Just forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat box shortly. And for APA continuing education credits, there will be a link also posted in the chat box, but later on in the latter stages of the evaluation. So keep an eye on the chat box for that. Make sure you open your link to the survey before you exit the webinar, and make sure you save your certificate after you complete the survey. We won't be able to have access to certificates of completion after you complete that survey. A recording and PowerPoint slides for this talk should be available sometime later this week. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Janet DeGiorgio Miller, who'll be overviewing parenting time / custody evaluations. But that's for this next week. Let's get back to this week. I'm thrilled to be introducing you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing use of the MMPI-3 in forensic evaluations. This is Dr. Yossef Ben-Porath. Dr. Ben-Porath is a professor of psychological sciences at Kent State University. He completed his doctoral training at the University of Minnesota and has been involved extensively in MMPI research for the past 38 years, so all the way back to the MMPI-1 days. He is a co-developer of the MMPI-3, the MMPI-2 restructured format, and the MMPI-adolescent restructured format, and co-author of test manuals, books, book chapters, and articles on the MMPI instruments. He's a former editor-in-chief of the journals Assessment and Psychological Assessment. Dr. Ben-Porath is also a board-certified psychologist whose clinical practice involves supervision and assessments of Kent State Psychological Clinic, consultation to agencies that screen candidates for public safety positions, and provision of consultation and expert witness services in forensic cases. Dr. Ben-Porath, Yossi, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, thank you so much for joining us here today. We're very honored and excited to have you joining us, and thankful for you sharing your immense expertise in this area with us. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Perillo, and thank you for the invitation to present to this forum today. I appreciate it. This next slide has some details regarding procedures for signing in, signing out. I believe it's also going to be posted in the chat for those who need additional information about it. Before turning to the substance of the presentation, I would like to offer a disclosure of my financial interest in the instrument that we're discussing. Today, I am a paid consultant to the MMPI publisher, the University of Minnesota Press, and distributor Pearson. I receive research funding from the University of Minnesota Press, and as co-author of the MMPI-2-RF and MMPI-3, I receive royalties on sales of test materials and scorings. Also a disclaimer, the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, and positions of the University of New Mexico. And with that, our agenda, so we're going to begin with a little bit of background for those who are not familiar with the MMPI-3, about the historical evolution of the MMPI instruments, which will lead to a rationale for the development of the MMPI-3, and then a brief description of the process we followed in developing the instrument. We'll then talk a little bit about the norms, the updated norms for the MMPI-3, and from there we'll move on to forensic considerations when using the test, talk a little bit about some of the relevant research. We'll discuss some diversity related considerations when using the MMPI-3, and then, as Dr. Perillo mentioned, we will have some time for some questions and answers at the end. And as you have questions along the way, please do feel free to type them into the Q&A box, but we won't get to them until the end of the presentation. All right, so beginning with our brief historical overview, as I'm sure you all or many of you are aware, the MMPI was originally published in 1943. The authors were Stark Hathaway, a psychologist, Charlie McKinley, a psychiatrist, and their goal in developing the instrument was that it would serve as a differential diagnostic test that could be given to any patient at the University of Minnesota Hospital, where McKinley was the chair of the neuropsychiatry department and Hathaway was a staff psychologist. And the test would be useful or used in developing and identifying the diagnosis so as to contribute to treatment planning. The method that they used was a contrasted groups approach where they assembled patients with 8 designated disorders, the ones that were most commonly receiving services at the hospital at the time: hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, paranoia, psychasthenia, schizophrenia, and hypomania. Those, of course, were also the labels assigned to the original clinical scales, and they contrasted the responses of each of those patient groups with the non-patient groups and identified items that significantly beyond a certain statistical criterion differentiated each of the patient groups from the non-patient group. The test did not work as intended. Once everything was done, the test was published and released. It was not possible to directly diagnose one or more of those disorders. The problem being that many patients produced multiple clinical elevations, including on scales that did not correspond to their diagnosis. So, for example, most patients with a clinically elevated score on the schizophrenia scale did not have schizophrenia. And if the test were to be interpreted as initially intended, the false positive rate would have been excessively high. And so instead, there was a very significant shift, a paradigm shift, if you will, away from using the individual scales to diagnose disorders to looking at patterns of scores, combinations of scores. Clinicians using the test, although it became very clear to them that they could not directly diagnose disorders, observed that certain patterns, certain combinations of scales tended to be elevated together, and that the patients who produced those patterns of scores that came to be called the cotypes had certain features in common, clinically relevant ones, certain symptoms of psychopathology, behavioral proclivities, personality traits were more commonly found in patients with one pattern of scores on the clinical scales versus others. And so the test evolved into an empirically based classification, description, and prediction system with empirical data collected to document the correlates of membership in these different code types. Other important aspects of the original MMPI included the use of validity scales to assess not psychological functioning, but the quality of the information provided by the test taker. Many supplemental measures were introduced over the years to help complement the information obtained from the code types. And the norms for the original MMPI were collected in the late 1930s, early 1940s in the state of Minnesota, and the normative sample was demographically very close to the population of the state at the time. But as time progressed, that normative sample, which was almost exclusively white with an average of 8 years of education, primarily farmers and laborers and their spouses, became increasingly inadequate. And it was the need to update the norms that was the focus of the development of the MMPI-2, which was released in 1989. The MMPI-2 was developed by a committee, the Restandardization Committee, it was called, again, emphasizing the need to restandardize or renorm the test. And indeed, those were the two primary goals: collect new norms and also enhance content coverage by removing some items that were not scored on the basic validity and clinical scales and replacing them with new items. So these norms were collected in the mid-1980s. The target for the normative sample was the 1980 census data, the demographic data reported in the 1980 census. The clinical scales were left intact in spite of concerns that had been expressed over the years about some of their psychometric properties. The committee, the majority of the committee at least, was of the opinion that updating both the norms and the clinical scales at the same time would be too radical of a change. And of those two needs, the need for new norms was deemed more pressing. And so the clinical scales were essentially left intact. New items were introduced via a set of content scales. And again, this was possible because there were quite a few items on the original MMPI that were not scored on the clinical or basic validity scales. Those were replaced with new items. Some new validity scales first introduced with the MMPI-2. There was, for those who may recall the period, some initial skepticism, in spite of a relatively conservative revision, some initial skepticism expressed by MMPI experts who were not involved in the restandardization, in particular about whether the cotypes could still be interpreted because of some normative changes that had occurred. But in relatively short order, most users transitioned to the MMPI-2. The next important milestone was the introduction in 2008 of the MMPI-2-RF, the restructured form. Alka Tellegen of the University of Minnesota and I co-developed the restructured form. Our goal, as described here in the slide, was to represent the clinically significant substance of the MMPI-2 item pool with a comprehensive set of psychometrically adequate measures. And basically, the goal was to apply modern test construction techniques, also technology that Hathaway and McKinley, of course, did not have available to them, to the item pool of the MMPI-2, which we continued and still do believe provides very important clinically relevant information, but to restructure the scales using, again, more modern test construction techniques and technology, and link the restructured scales of the instrument to current concepts and models in the field of personality and psychopathology so that we could rely not only on empirical correlates, but also on construct validity when interpreting scores on the restructured instrument. The process involved first restructuring the clinical scales. Those were actually added to the MMPI-2 in 2003, so 20 years ago. They've been part of the MMPI instruments for the past 20 years, the RC scales have, and then augment the restructured clinical scales with additional measures that were needed to achieve a comprehensive assessment of everything that could be reliably and validly assessed with the MMPI-2 item pool. Two things that we did not do with the restructured form: we did not add new items to the test, and we did not collect new norms. So we continued to use the 1980s norms with the MMPI-2-RF when it was released in 2008. And the 338 items of the restructured form were a subset of the 567 MMPI-2 items. This allowed us to rely on existing data that had been accumulated over time with the MMPI-2, both to develop and validate the restructured form. But those two needs, the need for eventually updating norms for the test from those that were collected in the mid-1980s and enhancing the coverage, the content coverage of the test, were the two objectives, the primary objectives for development of the MMPI-3. The MMPI-3 was released in November of 2020, so almost 3 years ago now. And we're going to talk about the new norms and some of the new item content here shortly. But as far as the norms are concerned, the one thing, of course, that one important reason for needing to update the norms were all the demographic changes that had occurred in the 30-some years since the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF norms were collected in the U.S., and we'll take a look at some of those demographics here in a little bit. But also all the experiential changes of the adult population of the United States. No member of the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF normative sample had ever heard of the internet, let alone social media. We live in a very different society these days, and so both demographically and experientially, the norms for the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF were becoming increasingly non-representative of the adult population of the U.S. What we wanted to do was to build on the foundations of the MMPI-2-RF, add some new scales that we'll talk about, enhance some of the existing MMPI-2-RF scales, and for the first time in the United States, collect both English and Spanish language norms for the MMPI-3. Throughout the process, though, we made it a point of emphasis in our analyses and checked along the way to make sure that indeed we were meeting this goal. We wanted to update the test in a manner that would allow us to continue to rely on the MMPI-2RF literature when interpreting scores on the MMPI-3, and we'll be talking about that and looking at some data relevant to that a little bit later on in the presentation. Okay, so development in short. We did some preliminary research. We had some questions we wanted to address before launching the actual data collection. The first had to do with the response format. Do we keep the true-false response format, or do we try or transition to a polytomous, or some people refer to it as a Likert or Likert scale response format. We collected some data, developed a version of the MMPI-2RF with a 4-point response format, collected some data to then check to see what impact that would have on the validity of scores on the scales, and found that it did not improve their validity, and decided as a result to retain the true-false response format. Did some work on modifying some of the items that had some awkward or dated wording, just some simplifications. There are a couple of examples here. The item "I love to go to dances" was revised to read "I love to go dancing," and the item "I have to take disappointments so keenly that I can't put them out of my mind" was revised to read "I'm likely to feel disappointments so strongly that I can't keep them out of my mind." So those are some examples of the simplification of some of the items. We also developed some new items. Our goal was to identify content that was missing from or insufficiently represented in the MMPI-2RF item pool. We consulted with experts, both researchers and users of the test, looked at existing measures, and ultimately developed as a first step 135 trial items, and then collected some research, did some additional writing, and wound up with a final list of 95 trial items that were candidates for inclusion on the MMPI-3. To give some example of content that was we deemed either altogether missing. For example, there were no items on the MMPI-2 and therefore also on the MMPI-2RF dealing with problematic eating behaviors. There were very few items dealing with compulsive behavior or impulsivity. So those are some examples, and we'll see some more with regard to the and when we look at the new scales here shortly. So to collect the data for developing the MMPI-3, we used an expanded version of the MMPI-2RF. It included a biographical and demographic questionnaire, the 338 MMPI-2RF items, including 43 of those items that were modified along the lines that I just illustrated. Then the 95 trial items. Of course, we needed a booklet and an answer sheet for the 433 item expanded booklet. And then importantly, Pearson developed a standalone version of its QLocal software called QLocal EX that we were able to make available to our field data collection sites. And what this allowed is for users to administer the expanded version of the test, but score the MMPI-2RF and use it in actual applied assessments in various settings. And this, of course, made it possible to collect actual assessment data rather than data that were only administered for the or collected for the purpose of research. And that was a very important aspect of the development of the instrument. All the new material, the biographical questionnaire, the 43 updated items, and 95 trial items were translated into Spanish. The starting point here was the existing Garcia-Azon version of the booklet for the MMPI-2RF. And then Tony Puente of the University of North Carolina at Wilmington assembled a team of experts, Spanish-speaking experts who did the translation following standard translation, back translation procedures, and Tony played a critical consulting role in the development of the Spanish language norms for the MMPI-3. Data were collected, 3 types of data: field data at various sites representing settings where the MMPI is used, including mental health, medical, forensic, and public safety. related assessments. These data, some of the data were used for scale development, other data for validation, and also for the development of comparison groups. If you're familiar with the MMPI-2RF, you know that we also had comparison groups for the previous version of the instrument. College student data were collected. A lot of data were collected here at Kent State, but also we made the instruments available to several researchers who expressed an interest in collecting their own data at other institutions and who have now been publishing. Now that the MMPI-3, of course, is available, they've been able to publish their own MMPI-3 research. For our purposes, we used the data for some of our initial psychometric analyses that were intended to make sure that we would be able to continue to apply the MMPI-2RF literature to the MMPI-3, and then also some very detailed validation analyses that appear in the technical manual. Normative data, we're going to get into this in more detail here shortly, but they were collected in English and Spanish, and also a bilingual sample of English and Spanish speakers. As far as some of the numbers are concerned, for the field data collection, total of 16,600 protocols were collected at various sites. You can see that there was a very relatively large number of those were collected at public safety sites, because we were seeking to develop 4 separate comparison groups for safety-related pre-employment evaluations of police officers, correctional officers, firefighters, and dispatchers. And we also collected data in forensic settings, correctional settings, forensic disability claimant sample as well. For the normative data collection, you see the numbers here: 2,382 individuals tested in English, 280 of them came back a week later for the purpose of collecting test-retest data, 664 Spanish speakers with 60 retested, and 45 individuals in the bilingual sample, for a total of 3,423 individuals collected as part of the normative data collection. So overall, we were working with approximately 28,000 protocols for the development of the MMPI-3. Scale development is described in detail in the technical manual. Basically, what we did using the field data was to first shorten some of the RC scales and then replace some of the RC scale items with new or augment them with new items. Some of the specific problem scales were lengthened and expanded. The higher order and Psi-5 scales were revised to address deleted items and incorporate new ones. And we also made some updates to the validity scales using new data collected for the MMPI-3 project. One important step in this process, once we had identified our pool of potential items for inclusion on the MMPI-3, using the Spanish language normative sample and the bilingual sample, all of the rewritten and new items that were selected for the MMPI-3 were examined to make sure that they work properly in Spanish, and one did not, and it was dropped from consideration and not included on the MMPI-3. The outcome of this development includes 5 new scales. The combined response inconsistency scale, and as the label implies, it basically combines information from VRIN and TRIN to get an overall indication of the level of inconsistent responding in a protocol. 4 new specific problem scales: eating concerns, compulsivity, impulsivity, and self-importance, which is a measure of overly positive self-regard. Grandiosity. Data show very clearly associations with measures of narcissism and narcissistic personality features for the self-importance scale. Several existing scales were substantially modified. The 5-item anxiety scale of the MMPI-2RF is now a 15-item anxiety-related experiences scale on the MMPI-3. Stress and worry was divided into 2 separate measures of stress and of worry, and the interpersonal passivity scale was reversed so that elevated scores now reflect domineering, overbearing behavior, and the scale is now labeled dominance, with low scores identifying individuals who are prone towards interpersonal passivity. To make room for new items, we did have to get rid of some of the MMPI-2RF scales. These are the ones that were dropped, and they're the ones that were less commonly used and researched on the MMPI-2-RF. At the end of the process, we wound up adding 72 new items, dropping 75 MMPI-2-RF items for a total of 335 items on the MMPI-3. You can see the vast majority of them come from the original MMPI, 220, 43 are MMPI-2 items, and then the 72 new items written for the MMPI-3. Reading level remains the same. If you're using the Flesch-Kincaid readability index, it's for grade 4.5, same as it was on the MMPI-2-RF. Total of 52 scales, 10 validity scales. The three-tiered hierarchical structure with 3 levels of measurement among the substantive scales, the 3 higher order scales, 8 restructured clinical scales. One of the RC scales, RC3, cynicism, is now included among the externalizing scales. This is based on some analyses run by Martin Selbaum. There's an appendix in the technical manual describing the rationale for the restructuring of the externalizing and the interpersonal scales that Selbaum wrote for the technical manual. And so we have 8 RC scales and then 26 specific problem scales, and also updated versions of the personality psychopathology or Psy-5 scales that focus on a dimensional model of personality disorder-related psychopathology. All right, a quick look at the norms, the MMPI-3 norms, and then we'll move on to some forensic-specific considerations. The normative data were collected between September 2017 and December of 2018 by a market research firm, Eureka Facts. They were selected to collect the normative sample or the normative data because of their expertise in assessing and reaching for recruiting individuals, Spanish-speaking individuals in particular, including undocumented individuals who we wanted to make sure to include in the normative data collection. The recruitment occurred via social media, newspaper ads, word of mouth. They also went to specific settings, including GED training settings, to try to reach individuals with less than a high school education, senior living settings, in order to try to reach older individuals, recruit them for the normative data collection. Each participant was paid $50 per session. So those who came back a second time were paid another $50. 98% of the sample was tested in via computer in a small number of data collection sites that were glitches that required use of paper and pencil. And there was a very, very small number of individuals who said that they were just not comfortable taking the test on a computer, and they were given the paper and pencil version, but again, a very, very small number. What this allowed us to do, the data collection via computer, was to monitor the data collection in real time as the data were being accumulated to make sure that we were meeting our demographic targets. So the English language normative sample was assembled from all of those who were tested to approximate projections that were available at the time we were developing the MMPI-3 from the U.S. Census Bureau for the 2020 census in terms of race, education, and age, and those projections wound up being very close to what actually emerged from the 2020 census. Final normative sample made up of 1,620 individuals, 810 identifying as men, 810 identifying as women. As we did for the MMPI-2-RF, we use only non-gendered T-scores, although we do have comparison groups that are separate for the men and the women of the MMPI-3 normative sample. These are the sites where the norms were collected. They were designed to represent different geographic regions throughout the U.S. These are some of the demographic data that I wanted to highlight. So what we see here, and this comes from the technical manual, this is the 2020 census projection for the proportion of the adult population that would identify as white, 62.5%. The MMPI-2 and MMPI-2-RF normative sample is 82% white, which was very close to the 1980 census that normative sample was designed to, was targeted for. On the MMPI-3, we have 60.3% whites in the normative sample. The other, of course, large change that has occurred over those decades was the proportion of individuals of Hispanic or Latinx origins. We use the term here that the Census Bureau uses, projected for the adult population to be 16.8% for 2020. Only 2.9% of the MMPI-2, MMPI-2-RF normative sample was identified as Hispanic. And for the MMPI-3, for the English language normative sample, we're at 14%. Now, of course, some of the 16.8% of the overall population cannot be tested in English and would be tested in Spanish using our Spanish language norm. So 14% actually over-represents the proportion of the adult population that would be tested currently in English, but that was done intentionally because that proportion will continue to grow. As far as the age distribution of the normative sample, the only group that we really did not collect as many as we would have hoped or did hope to achieve or collect were those 80 plus years individuals. You can see the 2020 census projection 5.1 for the MMPI-3, we're at 2.1%. Now, to some extent, this also reflects the fact that not all individuals in this age range can be tested with the MMPI, so the 2.1% may not be that far away from the proportion of the population that in that age range that can be tested with the MMPI-3, but it does point to the need, and we are focused on the need to collect some data focusing particularly on older individuals. As far as education is concerned, a problem with the MMPI-2, MMPI-2-RF normative sample was underrepresentation of individuals with less than high school education and overrepresentation of individuals with a college education. In the MMPI-3 normative sample, we're pretty close to the 2020 census projections for bachelor's degree or higher. We're still a little bit below the projection for less than high school education, but again, not all individuals in that subset of the population can be tested with the MMPI-3. Now, of course, a very important question was, have the norms changed? It could well have been that we would collect the data and then learn that nothing really has changed. The short answer to the question is yes, they have. And there are details in the manual that we don't have time to go over in our brief webinar today, but there are some validity scale changes, also some changes to the substantive scales. And so there was indeed a need not only from the standpoint of representing the population, but the norm. There are some important changes to the norms. For the Spanish language norms, those data were collected in some of the same sites that I mentioned earlier. But, of course, we focused on those sites where there's a larger Spanish-speaking population, and then compared the Spanish language normative data to the English language normative data, and found that although most of the means fell within 5 T-score points across the two normative samples, there were some important exceptions. There also was some reduced variability, which affects the norms, and this led us to conclude that separate norms are necessary and they are available for the Spanish language version of the test. Okay, turning to some forensic specific considerations. As I'm sure many here are aware, and this is not an exhaustive list, but the MMPI-3 can be and is used in criminal court, competency and criminal responsibility evaluations, risk assessments, violent risk assessments, mitigation and sentencing related evaluations, in civil litigation and personal injury and disability claims, family court. The test is often used in child custody or parental fitness evaluations. The validity scales play an important role, but of course, the primary focus in many of these is on the substantive scales and on the assessment of personality and psychopathology as it pertains to providing answers to psycholegal referral questions. We don't, again, have time to go into the specifics of these applications here today, but there are resources available that I'll be talking about here shortly. So a key issue whenever a new version of a psychological test, an updated version, is introduced, is potential implications for either admissibility if a challenge is mounted, or more commonly weight of the evidence based on MMPI-3, in our case, findings in the context of cross-examination. And there's an element of damned if you do or damned if you don't. If you use the newer version of the test, you can be challenged for using a new device, unproven could be the challenge. And damned if you don't. If you use the older version, you can be challenged for using outdated norms, for example, with the MMPI-2-RF or MMPI-2. The only way to avoid these challenges is to not update our tests. That's not a very satisfactory solution. So the alternative is for the forensic examiner to be familiar with the rationale for and outcomes of the revision, the things that we were just talking about, and make informed decisions about which version of the test to use. And in doing so, you may consider some of the factors that were laid out in the Daubert versus Merrill Dow decision regarding admissibility that, again, can also be applied to weight of the evidence. And we'll talk about each of these as it applies to the MMPI-3. These are, of course, the familiar Daubert factors or questions. Has the technique been tested? Has it been subjected to the research on the technique, been subjected to peer review, information about potential rate of error, standards controlling operation of the instrument, and is the technique generally accepted in the field or the discipline, which of course is the old Fry test that in some jurisdictions still applies in the US. So as to whether the technique has been tested, our empirical data available on the MMPI-3, of course, we included quite a bit of empirical data in the technical manual for the instrument. This is appendix, the list of tables or index to the tables in Appendix D of the technical manual. You can see that we report empirical correlates, validity findings for mental health outpatients, spine surgery, spinal cord simulator candidates, disability claimants, candidates for law enforcement positions, and some of those college validation data that I mentioned earlier. Altogether, almost 38,000 validity coefficients in Appendix D of the technical manual. This is just a small sampling. This is for data that were collected with a forensic disability claimant sample that was administered the DAPS, the Detailed Assessment of Post-Traumatic Stress. And I've highlighted correlations that point to the convergent validity, correlations between scores on the MMPI-3 and criteria or scales on the DAPS that we would expect to be correlated. RC7, of course, associated with various manifestations of PTSD, as is our somatic complaints scale, and the suicidality measure of the DAPS correlated with demoralization and low positive emotions, and particularly highly correlated with the suicidal death ideation scale of the MMPI-3. Anxiety-related experiences is our best indicator of PTSD-related problems on the MMPI-3, as the anxiety scale was on the MMPI-2-RF, and that's showing up in these highlighted correlations here. And then the DAPS has a substance abuse scale that is substantially correlated with the substance abuse scale of the MMPI-3. Another important source of information, empirical findings on the MMPI-3, is Appendix E of the technical manual that reports nearly 39,000 correlations. Now, in these tables, what we do is compare correlations between scores on either the MMPI-2-RF or the MMPI-3 version of scales with external criteria. This is the appendix that's intended to provide the most direct answer to the question, were we successful in maintaining continuity of the empirical correlates of scales that were carried over from the MMPI-2-RF to the MMPI-3. So we see here, for example, this is still looking at the DAPS, the suicidality scale. These are the correlations between the MMPI-2-RF demoralization and suicidality, and MMPI-3 demoralization scale and suicidality. And here we see RC1, the somatic complaints scale, with the hyperarousal scale of the DAPS, and the findings are quite consistent. The correlates are the same. The correlations are essentially interchangeable. They change at 1 or 2 points one way in both directions, so no systematic differences. RC7, the 2 versions of RC7 correlated with most of the PTSD features assessed by the DAPS, the 2 suicidal death ideation scales, and again, no need to belabor this. The findings, the empirical correlates are essentially the same for the MMPI-3 versions of MMPI-2-RF scales. These are the 2 substance abuse scales here. This is another set of data from Appendix E. This is a prison inmate sample that completed the Levinson self-report psychopathy scale, as well as the narcissistic grandiosity scale. And again, you can see that whether we're looking at the RF or the MMPI-3 versions, these are the externalizing scales. We get essentially interchangeable correlations. This is the correlation between our new self-importance scale in this prison inmate sample and the narcissistic grandiosity scale. And that was the scale, of course, that was the construct that was targeted with this self-importance scale. Comparable correlations for the Psy-5 scales. These are correlations also reported in the technical manual in Chapter 3, comparing the validity scales or correlating the validity scales across versions of the test. You can see very high correlations. Now, our FS and RBS are unchanged. That's why the correlations are perfect. But we did update the 3 and frequency scales for the MMPI-3, but in terms of what they measure is, as you can see, essentially the same. And that's also true for the underreporting scales of the MMPI-3. So basically, the validity scale findings in Chapter 3, the substantive scale findings in Appendix E all indicate that MMPI-2-RF findings can be applied to MMPI-3 versions of MMPI-2-RF scales. This includes 54,000 empirical correlates of the substantive scales that are reported in the MMPI-2-RF technical manual. Is there peer-reviewed research? As we just discussed, MMPI-2-RF findings can be applied to the MMPI-3. That includes now over 570 peer-reviewed publications, published studies on the MMPI-2-RF. We're also beginning to accumulate peer-reviewed publications on the MMPI-3. This requires collection of new data because of the new items, but there are over 40 peer-reviewed MMPI-3 publications at this point. Just to give you a couple of examples, this is a study that looked at the over-reporting scales of the MMPI-3 in a forensic disability claimant sample, comparing the ability of this over-reporting scales or examining their ability to identify over-reporting as designated by the SLIC criteria for malingered neurocognitive dysfunction. This is an incentive-only group, and you can see they produce somewhat but moderately elevated scores on the over-reporting scales. But if we compare them with the those who are classified as probable or definitely malingering, we get very substantial separation between the 2 groups. These are Cohen-D effect sizes, very large. Response bias scale of the MMPI-3 doing the best job, but also FS and the other infrequency scales also differentiating between the 2 groups. This is a paper that was published earlier this year in Law and Human Behavior, looking at the very important construct of cultural mistrust and its potential impact and the study focused on the MMPI-2-RF and the MMPI-3. So data were collected with the expanded booklet that allowed for scoring both the MMPI-2-RF and the MMPI-3. What these authors did was to enlist some judges. 6 Black doctoral level psychologists went through the item pool and identified for the RF or the MMPI-3 items that could reflect cultural mistrust rather than the targeted constructs. They found a total of 10 items across the 2 instruments. 9 are scored on the MMPI-2-RF and 9 on the MMPI-3. And as they expected, a disproportionate number of those items appear on RC6, ideas of persecution. They then also ran some analyses looking at endorsement frequencies in different groups of, they looked at both college students and a forensic inpatient sample. The largest effects that they found were related to age rather than race or ethnicity. The one item that showed the strongest difference between age groups was the item highlighted here, item number 233, which is people say insulting and vulgar things about me. And I suspect that this has something to do with the rates of social media use in that age range versus other age ranges. That when they looked at it, at these items in the aggregate, they did not find meaningful differences among the forensic inpatients, Black, Latino, and white. But they did find some differences in the college student samples. And again, the differences focused primarily on ideas of persecution and highlight the importance of taking, of course, culture into account when interpreting elevations on any scale, which is something that is part of our standard recommendations for the test. As far as error rate and the MMPI-3, of course, reliability data reported in the technical manual address this issue. We don't need to go into them in detail, but they document the fact that the test is not error-free. There is no such thing, but the reliability is adequate, and we have data related to standard errors of measurement that allow us to take measurement error to the extent that it occurs into account. For the validity scales, of course, we rely on sensitivity, specificity, positive and negative predictive power. These are the data that were reported in that Tyleki forensic disability claimant sample. And here we have the classification accuracies from a different study that used a simulation design. So again, these data are available. The answer to this question is yes, data are available relevant to potential error associated with MMPI-3 scores. Are there standards controlling the use of the MMPI-3? Of course, that's why we have a manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation. That includes very detailed guidelines for all three: administration, scoring, and importantly, interpretation of the instrument. And then finally is the MMPI-3 generally accepted. It is the most widely used version of the MMPI-3. You can find this information on the University of Minnesota Press website. In the first half of 2023, 56% of MMPI sales, adult version of the MMPI sales were of the MMPI-3 versus 22%, MMPI-2-RF 22%, MMPI-2. Those numbers are moving in the direction where the proportion continues to grow. And of course, between the MMPI-3 and the MMPI-2-RF, it's at 78% in the first half of this year. We talked about the fact that MMPI-2-RF research can be applied to the MMPI-3 and that the MMPI-3 normative sample represents the current population, adult population of the United States, and the importance of having Spanish language norms for the instrument. In terms of some resources that are available for MMPI-3 use, this is the new Interpreting the MMPI-3 book that's Martin Selbaum and I have authored. It's the update to the MMPI-2-RF book that was available. It will be available in January, this coming January, and provides very detailed information about the development of the MMPI-3 as well as interpretive guidelines. There's also a chapter 6, that focuses on diversity sensitive assessment with the MMPI-3. Some of the things that we highlight in that chapter is the fact that the finding that differences within groups in the literature, the MMPI literature over the years, has found that differences within groups are generally greater than mean differences across groups, and that this likely reflects the intersection of multiple variables in the development of individual differences, emphasizing the importance of considering the entirety of the individual's lived experiences when interpreting scores on the MMPI-3, and of course consulting the relevant literature, much of which is reviewed in that chapter 6 of our book. There's an article that was published last year in the Journal Personality Assessment. It's open access, so anyone can get a copy from the journal website on using the MMPI-3 in legal settings that I co-authored with Kirk Halbrin and Madalena Rizzo. There's also a chapter in the clinical forensic psychology book edited by Garofalo and Sichema that Martin Selbaum, Dustin Wygant, and Anthony Tereskavage and I co-authored. So there are several sources that are available. Martin Selbaum and Dustin Wygant are updating their casebook for the forensic casebook for the MMPI-3, and so these are some of the primary sources available at this time. Okay, as promised, I've left some time for Q&A. Hopefully, we've received some questions in through the Q&A box, Dr. Perillo.
We indeed have. So thank you so much, Dr. Ben-Porath, Yossi, for a very thorough covering of everything that's been new in the MMPI-3, including these updates now for me, seeing the 2023 rates that we can no longer really consider this arguably a period of transition. Now it is the MMPI-3 being the most commonly ordered of the versions here now. We do have several questions. Of course, if you have additional questions, feel free to enter them in the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can for about 5 to 10 minutes or so while we have Dr. Ben-Porath here. If you want to complete the CE link surveys, the links available are in the chat box, and the QR code is available there. Make sure you check that before you leave the webinar now. You did reference several times about updated norms and the efforts to be more representative with your U.S. Census Bureau data. And someone had a particular question about MMPI use as it pertains specifically to indigenous populations. And one question they had in particular was that when they administered the MMPI-2, they had noticed greater scores on what was then scale 4 and certain patterns. Having worked with native tribes, many have high ACEs scores as well. How has the MMPI-3 addressed this?
So that's one of the issues that we address in that chapter that I mentioned, chapter 6 of the new Interpreting the MMPI-3 book. So there's a lot more information there than I'll be able to cover in just a short answer, because there's some research going back many years to the original MMPI, but also some with the MMPI-2 as well, that has identified that for indigenous individuals, there are some items, certain items. It's not a large number, but some items, I think in that one study that they identified 30 MMPI-2 items that could have be influenced by cultural factors unique to the indigenous population. So the most important thing is to be aware of the fact that culture does affect, of course, how individuals respond to test items, and of the importance of taking the totality of the individual's lived experiences into account when interpreting scores on the test. We do have some indigenous individuals in the normative sample. The demographic data that I showed are just a subset of what's included in the technical manuals. There's an entire appendix with very detailed information about the demographic makeup of the test. But the most important thing is to be culturally knowledgeable and to, if you're assessing an individual of indigenous origins, to know how that culture could affect their responses, how spirituality related items might be affected. The one item about ghosts and spirits is no longer on the MMPI-3. That's an item that did very commonly wind up getting answered in the key direction for reasons other than its intended construct. But I think the most important thing is to bring that knowledge to the interpretation of the test.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Several people have asked about if there are particular either norms or the normative sample for particular forensic context. So I'll just try to throw a couple out here. The first one, someone asked if there are or plans to have specific forensic or psychiatric inpatient samples in the MMPI normative groups.
So we have data have been collected at a forensic, obviously that one study that I mentioned, the data were collected at a forensic psychiatric inpatient setting. The numbers are not large enough yet to allow us to create a comparison group, but we're adding comparison groups on a regular basis to the MMPI-3. At this point, the only forensic specific comparison groups that are available are disability claimants, but we will be adding to the next update, which will occur in the middle of 2024. There will be child custody litigant comparison group data added, parental fitness evaluee data added. In all likelihood, pretrial criminal defendant comparison groups will be added as well, and hopefully psychiatric inpatient, although testing is quite rarely done these days in those settings, so it takes longer to accumulate those data sets.
The parental fitness was going to be my follow-up one there, so thank you for addressing that. Someone had a question about public safety norms. They said they noticed that the public safety norms were derived from populations in the Pacific Northwest and Southern California. Are these expected to be valid with populations in other places such as New York City?
So those weren't the norms. Those were correlate data in the technical manual that were from the Pacific Northwest and Southern California. We do have comparison group data for 4 public safety positions, and actually an interpretive report for each of those positions as well: police officer, correctional officer, firefighter, and dispatcher. And those data were collected throughout the United States. So they're not limited to one geographic region or another. The police candidate norms also include Canadians.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that for them. Someone asked if you could provide a general example of how you would respond to a Daubert inquiry about error rate in the MMPI-3.
Well, what I would talk about is that psychological test scores are not error-free, and that talk a little bit about the concept of reliability and standard errors of measurement, but use less technical terminology, and just indicate that those data, reliability, standard errors of measurement, are taken into account in the development of the interpretive guidance for the instrument. And so we know what the error rates are, and we take them into account when interpreting scores on the test.
You had noted some updating on the phrasing of certain questions, and someone said from their experience they had noticed on the MMPI-2-RF that some people that had completed it often complained about confusion around double negatives in certain questions, and were asking if anything was, if there were any updates to the MMPI-3 that was related to that.
So there are fewer double negatives, but there still are double negatives on the MMPI-3. It makes it all but impossible to have false keyed items if you want to eliminate all double negatives. But the items that were selected for the MMPI-3 were selected because empirically they were found to work. And so we certainly can find individuals who struggle with the double negatives, but it's not at a level that impedes the psychometric functioning of the items. And of course, the Trin scale is the scale that we need to look at if we have concerns that someone may not be able to manage double negatives. That's going to show up as an elevated score on the Trin scale of the MMPI-3.
Wonderful, thank you. Somebody wanted to know if you could elaborate on the item content of the new scales of compulsivity and self-importance.
Yeah, the compulsivity items have to do with need for control and constant checking of things. For example, doing things a certain way, always doing them in a certain way. And the self-importance items have to do with having very high self-regard, believing that one has special talents and is brilliant and stands out among people, content along those lines.
Wonderful. One final question here then to wrap up. Somebody said If we're giving the MMPI-3 in our clinics, but the interpretation manual is not available until early 2024, how can we appropriately and thoroughly provide interpretations in the meantime? Are there resources that we can use until that manual comes around?
The book that comes out in 2024 is a textbook. The manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation that was released along with the test in 2020 contains all the information needed to interpret scores on the MMPI-3, very detailed guidelines for how to write the interpretation up, scale by scale interpretive guidelines, some case illustrations, all are included in the manual for administration, scoring, and interpretation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Yossi, Dr. Ben-Porath, for a very thorough and helpful conversation about the latest and greatest updates to the MMPI. We're very thankful to have you and your expertise here to go over this with all these practitioners and training practitioners.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for attending the training.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Yossi.
Thanks,
Yes.
Jeff. Take care.
That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week. Take care.